I often joke in yoga classes that your ego is not your amigo. But the truth is that the ego can actually and does serve a positive responsibility within our life. Our ego in yoga is called the ahamkara, and it's our form identity. And you think about when we were born, we came into this world with no labels, and then somebody gave us a name, and as we go through life, we start to stack various labels onto who we are. We have a nationality, we have a gender, we have a race, a skin color, and all these things, a job, an occupation. And all of these over time begin to crystallize into this form identity. There's a Balinese saying that says that babies and the elderly are closest to God, whereas middle-aged people with mortgages are the furthest away from God. So let's talk about the unhealthy ego. So the first stage is the unhealthy ego. All the labels that we're given, all the dramas and the traumas that we move through life, they begin to stack on top of each other. And eventually all of this creates what's called a pain body. And from this pain body, we have all this unconscious suffering, where we find ourselves in these same repetitive loops and patterns and cycles and situations over and over again, and we don't know why, because it's unconscious. Pema Chodron said that nothing ever goes away until it teaches us what we need to learn. So if you find yourself in the same relationship over and over again, and you find the same stuff coming over and over again, it's because you haven't learned the lesson why. And the moment that you learn is the moment that you become free of that pattern. There's two kinds of suffering in this world. There's the suffering that we're running away from, and then there's the suffering that we're moving towards because it's going to help us become free of suffering. So the great challenges and the great adversities that we face in life ultimately help us to become free. There was a commando who was traveling in a remote area of the Himalayan mountains, and he had this deep burning question. So he found this Zen master in the middle of nowhere. He knocks on the door, the Zen master opens up the door, and he asks with humility and sincerity, he says, I have this question. Why is the world in such a dark place, and what can I do to help humanity? And the monk, the Zen master, could feel the sincerity of this commando. So he invites him inside. They go out back, and he draws a big circle into the ground with his staff. He grabs two bags of rocks, these pebbles, and he spills into the circle all these dark gray colored stones, and he spreads them out across the circle. And he says, when the world is fueled by the unhealthy ego with dark, destructive thoughts represented and symbolized through these dark stones, the world too will become dysfunctional and unhealthy. And then he slides the rocks out of the circle, and then he pours the other bag, which are these light-colored stones. And he says that these stones are reflected of the healthy ego, positive and benevolent thoughts. And he says, when the world has these kind of thoughts, this is what we'll experience. But I want you to imagine that that circle is your mind, and that you have to put the light-colored stones inside of that circle. And when you control that, then you'll begin to make a real impact on the rest of the world. And so that now brings us to the next stage, which is the healthy ego. So the key from progressing from the unhealthy or the dysfunctional ego into the healthy ego is really about awareness. It's about being aware that you have this ego, that you have this identity, that you have these labels. In shamanism, they call it seeing the dragon. You can't fight an enemy that you don't even know exists. Or in mindfulness, we call it name it to tame it. It's that realization that there's a dimension of you that's actually much bigger and much more spacious than the fluctuations of thoughts and memories. In fact, research shows that the memories that we have, 50% of them are actually inaccurate. So these things that we think are true inside of our mind, really half of them aren't even true. So this fluctuation of memories and thoughts and sensations and breath and emotions and feelings, they all have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so the healthy ego is able to zoom out. It's almost like having this 10,000 foot perspective on the impermanence and the fluctuation of all these things that come and go. And that's a game changer, because then you realize that you're more than your thoughts. You're more than just your thinking process. For a lot of people that get depressed and even become suicidal, they're so trapped within that thinking process. They're so imprisoned by that dysfunctional or that unhealthy ego, they can't imagine anything outside of that. So you get out of the cage, you get out of that prison. The ego is always small. It's a contraction that takes place. You think about when you function from your ego, what happens? You get stressed, you start to clench, you feel small. So that word ego stands for edging goodness out. You're not allowing that spacious goodness, that deeper dimension that exists, the ability to come in. You're functioning in the small self instead of functioning in the big self. So it's really about getting spacious. A wise teacher once was explaining this notion of the importance of spaciousness to his students. So he gets out a cup of water and he grabs a teaspoon of salt and he says, this salt represents all things that are toxic and negative. So he pours the salt into the cup, has the student drink it, and of course that small cup of water has been polluted and tainted by the salt, the negativity. But then he takes it and he pours it into a huge, massive jug of water, and it's so spacious that the spaciousness easily absorbs the negativity of the salt, and that big jug of water continues to remain pristine and unfazed by that negativity. So you only get stressed out when you sweat the small stuff. But when you're spacious in your mind and when you're spacious in your heart, you stop sweating that small stuff, because again, you're residing in that big self. The healthy ego is really about getting your mind under your control. When we're in unhealthy ego, the mind is running the show instead of us running the show. It's also about dealing with the unfinished business of the heart. You know, those past dramas and those past traumas. Unless we turn towards that and we do the work to process it, to digest it, to clear it, it's in us. It's that pain body that's running the show. And when you don't deal with your demons, they deal with you. So in order to become liberated and free of that, we have to do that work, whether it's going and seeing a good therapist or learning mindfulness, having right relationship to that unfinished business of the heart, and having the courage to stop running away from it, but to actually turn towards it. The ego is kind of like a tool that needs to be mastered. It's like a weapon that needs to be regained control over. There was a samurai who, after much death and destruction, he realized that he was lacking peace. So he went to go see a wise monk, and he asked the monk, he said, I just want peace in my life, but I can't find it. And the monk looks at him and he sees that he has his sword, and he says, the sword is meant to be an instrument of peace. And the samurai was confused. He asked the teacher, "What do you mean? It's a weapon of peace. All I know is that it's a weapon of destruction." And he goes on to explain that in the same way a knife can be used to kill somebody, or a surgeon can use it to heal somebody, the sword is the same. So the samurai stayed with this wise monk, and he learned the teachings of wisdom. He learned the teachings of mastering your mind and your actions and your words and your emotions and your heart, and doing all these things, so that then when he went to go wield the sword, it had a whole different intention and connection to it. And after many years of learning this, he went down from the mountaintop, and he used that sword for equality and for justice and for benevolence. He became a great leader, and he also became a great teacher, also teaching many other up-and-coming samurais that the sword was an instrument of peace. And this is what it means to be in that healthy ego. Your ego is like that sword. Your ego is like that instrument, and you have to learn how to wield it. Now, there's one final stage, and that final stage is the illuminated ego. So the illuminated ego is when the ego, the veil of the ego, becomes so thin and so translucent that the spirit that resides within is able to radiate out in an unobstructed way. This is where every thought, every word, every action is really used as a way to help uplift humanity. There's a great tradition in one African country where they describe it delivering the cargo. In delivering cargo, they say that each person is born with a very special and specific mission, and that is to deliver this cargo. And that cargo in other traditions is your dharma. It's your purpose. We have two purposes in this life. One purpose is to become free of that unhealthy ego, and the other purpose is to help other people, once we become liberated, to also break free of that unhealthy ego. And when we do that, we're all uplifted. You know, we all have goals, we all have desires, and one way that you know the source of your goal, the intention of that goal is pure, is that when you finally obtain that goal, the joy that you feel from that is unending. It lasts a really long time. But when you have a goal and it originates and the intention comes from that unhealthy ego or the dysfunctional ego, the moment that you achieve the goal or the moment that you satiate that desire, the happiness may be there, but it's very, very fleeting, and it goes away very quickly. So this could be somebody in social media that reaches a milestone of a certain amount of subscribers. Could be somebody that wants a certain amount of money, or they want to drive a certain type of car. They have that goal, and it's to feed that unhealthy ego, and then they get that thing. But the happiness only lasts a very short period of time. So ultimately, we want our intentions, we want those to come not from that unhealthy ego, but we want it to come from this illuminated ego, which is to be of service to others. There was an Indian sage, Sri Nisargadatta, that says, "Wisdom says I am nothing, love says I am everything, and it's between these two that my life flows." And I love this quote because when he says wisdom says I'm nothing, it speaks to the emptiness of the small self. It speaks to the emptiness of that unhealthy ego, which really is nothing. It's just a big illusion. But then when he says that love says that I am everything, it's talking about the big self, the illuminated ego. It's that spirit that resides within, which is everything, because it creates connection, it creates wholeness, it creates community. It's the very medicines that we need in this world today. There was a teacher who instructed his students the following day at the first sign of light to do their spiritual practices. So they woke up the next day and they were about to do their practices, and they realized they were a little unsure what their teacher meant. So they went back to him and they said, how do we know that we've seen the first sign of light? Is it when we look out over the valley and we can tell the difference between an olive tree and an oak tree? Is this how we know that we've seen the light? And the teacher shook his head no. And then they said, well, is it when we look out over the valley and we can tell the difference between a dog and a sheep? Is this how we know that we've seen the light? He shook his head again. No. And they said, well, is it that first moment where that sun is rising above the horizon and that first shaft of golden light starts to spill out? Is this how we know that we've seen the light? Once again, he shook his head no. And he went on to explain, you'll know that you've seen the first sign of light when you walk up to a stranger, you look into their eyes, and you realize that the spirit that exists inside of them is the exact same spirit that exists inside of you. This is how you know that you've seen the light, and until then, you're living in darkness. And that is what it means to be in the illuminated ego.